and welcome to Season 1 of the new series Teaching Matters on the PsychSessions Network. This series is co-hosted by Dr. Rob McEntarffer, who serves as an assessment specialist for the Lincoln Public School System in Lincoln, Nebraska, and me, Eric Landrum, your humble podcast servant from Boise State University and co-founder of PsychSessions. Rob and I, we had a blast recording these chats, 12 episodes in all in Season 1, including this brief introductory episode. Episodes 2 through 12 range in length from 16 minutes to 35 minutes each. So they are meant to be bite-sized, suitable for binge listening if you wish. Oh, we ramble quite a bit, and at times you might laugh with us or laugh at us. Honestly, we don't care which. Please know that the viewpoints expressed here represent Rob and Eric's own opinions respectively, and not the opinions of their individual employers. As we discuss teaching matters, we hope these conversations will be provocative and thought-provoking. If you have ideas for future episode topics or want to comment, most podcast outlets allow for comments, or you can email us at psychsessionspodcast@gmail.com. Now, I will put that email address in the liner notes for each episode, show notes, but here it is again, all one word, psychsessionspodcast@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening, and enjoy Season 1 of Teaching Matters.
Did you do the APA virtual last time around? I did not.
I have not done any online conferences yet.
I think this is related to something we brought up last time about the value added of in-person versus online. And I've had good and bad, like everybody else, pandemic conference experiences. ARA isn't going well yet, but maybe it'll turn around.
Oh, you're doing that in the midst of like today as we're recording this?
Yeah. It's just, I tune in when I want to. So
yeah. And I'll see your bet and I'll raise you. Even when we return to face conferences. And again, I can't remember if we've talked about one of the hazards of my aging. I can't remember if we've talked about this already or not. I'm not so sure when ACT returns to face or APA, APS, RMPA, even though the regionals, I'm not so sure how frequently I will return to those, because the game changer for me in the pandemic has been, I do want to spend time with my dear close friends. I really do. But I would rather fly to them or meet them somewhere in between and maybe meet up with 3 or 4 people and spend 2 to 3 days with a small group than spend 3 or 4 days with a group of 200 or 2,000 and have a bunch of quick hits. I am convinced now that I want quality time over quantity contacts.
Yeah, that makes sense. And maybe one of the lasting impacts of COVID is we value our in-person contacts more. When it was easy, I'll use this word deliberately because it might make somebody laugh. When it was easy to be promiscuous, when it didn't matter as much, the stakes weren't as high, we maybe didn't value the value added of in-person nearly as much as we will now. So we might be more careful and realize how precious it is. So we would just invest more in going to see the people we want to see and do the people that we want to talk to, rather than just go into a conference and spending time in the same room as people, but not getting a chance to talk to them.
First off, thank you for the title of this episode, Promiscuity. I really do appreciate that, Rob, because titles are sometimes a bear to come up with. But my mindset has changed about travel. I used to love to rack up the miles and get the free access to the club. And I remember conversations with Susan Nolan and Maureen McCarthy about, you got to get the United Club because, that was so nice. And, the one in DC is great, but they've just redone the one in Dallas or whatnot. It's snobbery about travel. But something that you and I were part of that we don't often talk about a lot, but I think the experience that I'm alluding to is what we call colloquially the Austin Seven, where we wrote a grant and we had the funding to bring together 7 academics to Austin, Texas for 3 days, 2 nights paid for in a rental space in June or July of, I think, 2018 to think big about assessment and student learning. And I would much rather commit to that time frame and spend time with a small group of people than go to APA. And even though there'll be amazing Division II programming, don't get me wrong, and there'll be world-class people presenting who are dear friends of ours, I just don't want the quick hits in a hallway or in an escalator and going to dinner with 40 people where I'm only going to get to talk to the one to the left of me and the one to the right of me, and it's going to be miserably loud, as opposed to I'll get on a plane and meet up with somebody or 2 or 3 people and just really spend some quality time.
Yeah, and a lot of people are going to be laughing hearing this because it totally sounds like we're talking about playing the field or settling down for a relationship. That's what it sounds like. We're maturing and we want to settle down. Instead of the quick hits, instead of the short conversations, we want a commitment.
Yeah, yes, but the only difference is I don't want them with just one person. I want to nurture those deep friendship relationships with probably 10 or 12 people.
Yeah.
It's not just the same person over and over, like in a real romantic relationship. There's a bunch of people I want to spend meaningful time with, but not 200 or not 2,000. And maybe that's being selfish. Actually, I know it's being selfish on my part.
So you and I are both fans of format, and we like talking about being deliberate and planning teaching formats. And I got the pleasure of having a manuscript edited by you once, and I know you know a lot about APA format.
Sure.
And the purpose of format in teaching and in writing, I promise I'm going somewhere with this, is efficiency of communication for a specific purpose for a specific audience, right?
Yeah.
Conferences, the traditional conferences that we're talking about, flying out, going to a conference, seeing a whole bunch of people for a short period of time, that model might be good for a specific purpose. Maybe we're after a slightly different purpose now.
Okay, Rob, you brought up a really excellent point. So congratulations. Mm-hmm. And this is delicate. So
yeah.
So let's go here because this is our damn podcast. And,
right.
And a ton of our friends are going to be able to connect with this. And I think for some listeners, this, maybe not for that many, but I think when people think it through, they'll get it. I think people in their careers come to a place where many times going to a conference, you start in your career going to conferences to be a learner. You go to conferences to pick up new techniques, new ideas, to get energized, to hear the experts in the field. And over time, as you stay in that field and you gain confidence and skills and expertise, there is a shift or transition, including the role of conferences, where you shift from being the learner at the conference to being the teacher at the conference, where you still go to sessions and you still hear some ideas, but less and less often they become new. And so I'll go to hear you or Steve Chu or Regan Gurung or Jane Hallen or Danae Hudson. I'll go to hear my besties talk about stuff. And odds are I probably already read the thing that they've written. And I've already seen their slides at another convention. And the thing that I will learn is the nuance of how they explained it as an example. But I probably won't be hearing about the concept they're talking about for the first time. Whereas many audience members may be learning about the conference for the first time. So I don't want to be the complete ass here saying, I don't learn anything when I go to a conference. There are some nuances that I will pick up, but odds are I'm not hearing about retrieval practice cues and practice effects for the first time when I hear Pooja Agarwal speak. She's awesome, but she's been writing about it for years, and you and I have been reading about it for years. But people who might have gone to ACT in 2019 heard about it for the first time.
Yeah, I like this. You're describing an arc that teacher researchers go through, and at different points in that arc, we get different things out of conferences, which might mean we go to different conferences or go or don't go. I wonder if there's a parallel. I know you've talked about in classrooms, we've got an arc too. I don't know if you were like this, but when I first started teaching psychology, I didn't have much of a background at all. So I was using my entire working memory just to stay 30 seconds ahead of what I was about to say next, what was going to come out of my mouth next. And my teacher arc was, as I got more and more expert, I was able to change the format of my classroom. And now, if I was able to go back to a classroom, and I might get to go back, hopefully, in one classroom next year, I'm super excited about a very different format. I'm really interested in the inter-teaching stuff that Garth has talked about and Brian Saville and others have talked about, where I couldn't have done that as a younger teacher. That just wasn't where I was. So maybe as we change, our interaction with students changes, what we're able to do with our format in our classroom. And that's paralleled in what we get out of conferences and how we absorb research.
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. The arc of our career changes, the arc of our experience and confidence and self-confidence changes. And I think I've told this story and I've written about it publicly. So it to some people who are super bored and read my stuff, it won't come as a surprise. But when I first started 30 years ago, when I picked the intro psych textbook, I didn't pick the best. I didn't select this is embarrassing. I didn't pick the best book to adopt for my students. I picked the best book to keep for me as the instructor. And I picked a lesser book for my students because I wanted the clearest book with the best explanations that I could use for my lecture notes as I prepared my overhead transparencies. Because yes, I was teaching over 30 years ago. They were overhead transparencies and not PowerPoints. And I purposely made that pedagogical decision that I needed the best explanations when in theory, I really should have been giving my students what I thought were the best explanations and the best textbook materials for them. But I was young and naive and a brand new teacher of introductory psychology, and I didn't have the confidence to do that.
I can relate to that. And maybe what you and I are just rehashing is a lot of curse of knowledge research, right? Just in a new context, perhaps. The more expert we become, or at least the more experienced we become, our needs change, our abilities change in the classroom. And then also early on, when I first started teaching psychology, I probably shouldn't have been allowed to because I didn't have enough curse of knowledge. So I needed some curse of knowledge just to stay barely ahead of students. And as that changes, we're better able, maybe it's two sides of a coin or a double-edged sword as a better analogy. Maybe we might be better able to do more things in a classroom and change up the format, but maybe we're less able to relate to beginning learners. The curse of knowledge probably increases during the arc of our teaching. I might have taught some stuff better early on.
Absolutely. I think anyone who's being honest as a new teacher, and I suspect it's K-12 or higher ed, anyone who's being honest in the very beginnings of their career probably knows that they're not doing the best that they'll ever do, that they're stumbling, bumbling, and fumbling. I distinctly remember, Rob, teaching in graduate school, teaching my first job out of graduate school, coming home to my wife at the time, and I said these words: I wish I could refund their tuition today because I did not do a good job. And I wish I could refund them today. However, what I knew my students appreciated is that they saw me trying, and they saw me come back the next day and come back and say, all right, Monday was a disaster and I apologize. Here's the things I need to correct from Monday that I told you I actually had it all. When you asked a question, I got all flustered, and I apologize for that. So I want to correct what I said about the neuron, because what I said was actually wrong. And here's what the correct information is. And I'm really sorry, and I'm going to do better next time. So even though I was flubbing up at the beginning of my career, my students could see that I was trying hard and I was sincere. And I think for me, that was the saving grace, because sadly, either whether as a grad student or even my first job, they saw other older cantankerous faculty members who had stopped caring.
Yeah.
So that was the saving grace.
Absolutely. And I think you hit on another maybe interesting difference between K-12 and college. And I haven't heard anybody talk or write about this, but the rhythm is different. But the phenomena are largely the same. What you just described, where a class doesn't go well, and you reflect maybe overnight, because you probably don't see those students again for another couple days at the earliest. And then you admirably pick up the pieces that are academically honest with them and help them not develop misconceptions. The same thing happens constantly with K-12, or at least in high school, but the rhythm's different. If I really tank a class, the next time I might get to try is in 5 minutes when the next class comes in. And that rhythm, I think, changes the nature of the reflection and the response to that reflection. So you were vulnerable, so I'll tell my story. I also taught a philosophy class for a long time at the high school where I taught. So I taught a lot of things, English and stagecraft and psychology and philosophy. And eventually I was mostly a psychology and philosophy teacher. But early on, I had even less background in philosophy than I had in psychology, but no one else was going to teach it. So I remember teaching the term epistemology and the idea of epistemology early on. And I taught it in a certain way, and I had a certain definition, just like you, on a transparency that was on an overhead projector. And a young man, I apologize about those notifications. I'll turn those off next time. A young man in the philosophy class tentatively raised his hand and said, "Are you sure that definition of epistemology is right?" And I wasn't ready to be vulnerable at that point, so I confidently said, "Yes, you'll learn about it later," and bluffed my way through. I looked it up and I had it completely wrong, completely, utterly wrong. And I also checked that this was early in the semester, and I also looked at the student's last name and thought, and then checked the student's last name and looked at University of Nebraska Lincoln, and the student's father was the head of the philosophy department and was the editor of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Epistemology. I corrected that the next day. But the differences in rhythm and frequency is a better term, between college and high school might be something for someone to explore sometime, how teachers adapt differently based on that rhythm.
I would imagine that, yes, because a high school teacher has a lot of different students and gets to know those students much better over the course of a year or even a half a year, depending on the format. Whereas if I have 2 sections of research methods with 35 students each, and I see them 2 or 3 times a week, I have to tell you, Rob, at this point in my career, I might not even learn all of their names over a 15-week semester, especially now that they're handing everything in online. When I was handing papers back by hand, face-to-face, that was the way I learned names. But when people hand things in online, I might not learn 60, 70 names. It's a difficult skill for me to pick up. So I think you're right about rhythms and pacing, but also volume of students, I think probably makes a difference as well. And to come back to your original point, there were times when I was not willing to be vulnerable early in my career. I remember teaching a summer school course in statistics and a student really pressing me to explain the numerical meaning of a correlation coefficient. So what does the 0.7, what does the 7 mean? Compared to a negative 0.8, what does the 8 mean? It's not linear. There is an underlying relationship, but it's not linear and it's not easy. But I tried to bluff my way through it. And when you said it, it brought that shiver back to me. It was like, he said, "Are you sure?" in my explanation. And I said, "Yep." that's what's going to be on the test. Because also something that I resonate with what you said, I was oftentimes about 30 minutes ahead of my students. Not only was I 30 minutes ahead of my students, but my first job, assistant professor, I was 26. And although many of my students were 18 to 22, we also had non-traditional students. So I had students my age and plenty of students older than me at the time. And many students didn't bother them at all that I was younger than them. But sometimes you would have students that would rub them the wrong way. And so sometimes I had to walk into the classroom, and at 26, someone would try to push me around a bit, and I had to be a little bit more harsh than I cared to be, just to shut it down.
Boy, I think someone needs to write about this, because you and I, this is the bluffing experience, and that power dynamic experience is something that you and I both experienced. And we have a bunch of advantages too. We're both fellows. We're both white fellows. The dynamic between demographics and teaching and power imbalances and age. Maybe somebody has written about this, but I would love to see from the point of view. I bet this idea of bluff is a pretty universal teaching experience. And I would love to hear people talk about how they worked through that, and especially people who are very different from me, whether they could actually use it or not. And if they couldn't use it, what did they do?
Yeah, and I think it does get manifested in the literature sometimes under imposter phenomenon.
Yeah.
Or you'll hear people informally talk about fake it till you make it. And I know award-winning professors who will talk about, oh, I still have to fake it till we make it. In fact, I know we're going to switch topics here in a moment, but I'll share. I had a chance to interview recently Tony Puente for the podcast. He's a recent past president of the American Psychological Association, and he was one of the biographers of Roger Sperry of split brain research fame. And Roger Sperry was the first psychologist to win the Nobel Prize. And he became a biographer. He actually worked and studied and became a friend of Roger Sperry. And Tony had shared with me, and this is on the podcast, that one time Tony is over at Roger's house and they're in his backyard, and Roger Sperry, award-winning, Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, turns to Tony and says, "Do you think I made a difference?" So if an award-winning Nobel Prize psychologist has self-doubts about making a difference, it's not that far-fetched for others, including non-white, non-males, to have those self-doubts. And I think you're exactly right. If we had those moments early in our careers, others are having those moments as well.
I bet. And in higher ed, you've got another dynamic that we don't often deal with in K-12, which is supposed prestige of institution, which I bet connects with all of them.
Supposed prestige is a really good way to say it, because we always think the grass is greener everywhere else. And at Boise State with the blue turf, we really do tend to think that the grass is always greener. We always think that things are great at Harvard and Princeton. And I would bet you donuts to dollars that the faculty at Harvard are complaining all the time about the conditions and the salary and what's going on. I think everybody.
And maybe their imposter complex and both conscious and unconscious bluffing, maybe there's more of a pressure there.
Oh, absolutely. And they're probably comparing themselves to Oxford, and their peer group is clearly not Boise State, but it's probably, and they have their own peer group that they compare to. But I don't know.
I have a friend who teaches at a boarding school in the East Coast. He's a theater teacher, and he and I talk high school teaching sometimes. And there's an article that recently came out in the Atlantic about private schools, boarding schools, elite boarding schools. And it turns out that much of the incoming class of supposed Ivy League schools comes from a very small number of private boarding schools in the country.
I think some of that is coming out with the admission scandal stuff that's coming out now too. But there's a linkage there.
It manifests to him in that he calls it a luxury product school. He teaches at a school that's quite expensive for parents to send their students to. But in our conversations, it came out that our teachers in our high schools get a hell of a lot more help with curriculum and pedagogical advice and support than he does. It's almost as if you get hired at one of these places, you should already be expert, know what you're doing, and not need help from anybody. And you and I know that does not serve teachers well. Just teaching in isolation without support or contact with anybody else is not necessarily a great sign for the health of the classroom or the skills of a teacher. So the prestige of an institution might influence teachers to bluff or fake it till you make it in ways that aren't healthy for students and learning.
Absolutely.